Part 1. The Dinner Invitation. It began innocently enough, as most stories do. I was in the kitchen on a rainy Thursday evening, chopping vegetables for a soup I'd probably be eating alone again, when the thought struck me, why not have a real dinner? Something special, something for the two of us. My husband, Richard, had been glued to his work for months. Late nights, early mornings, and constant calls had become the norm since his big promotion. I was proud of him, of course, but his absence had started to feel like a quiet void in our lives. I missed the man who used to dance with me in the kitchen just because our favorite song came on, or who'd stay up debating the merits of pineapple on pizza until we both dissolved into laughter. So when he walked in that night, dropping his briefcase by the door and loosening his tie, I greeted him with a warm smile and an idea. What do you say to a nice dinner this weekend? Just the two of us. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. That sounds great, he said, leaning down to kiss me on the cheek. My heart soared. Finally, I thought. A chance to reconnect. But then came the curveball. Actually, he added almost too casually, I was thinking we could invite a few of my colleagues. Ethan, Jake, and Clara. They've been working so hard lately, and I thought it might be nice to show them some appreciation. I blinked at him, knife hovering midair over a half-chopped carrot. Your colleagues? For dinner? Yeah, he said, oblivious to the growing knot in my stomach. They're great. You'll love them. They've been helping me so much at work, and honestly, I think you'll enjoy their company. I forced a smile, though inside I felt a pang of disappointment. I'd been looking forward to an intimate evening, candles, wine, maybe even talking about something other than spreadsheets and deadlines. But Richard was already animated, rattling off stories about Ethan's quick wit, Jake's incredible problem-solving, and Clara's sharp instincts. They're practically family, he finished, beaming. Family, sure. As the days passed and the dinner drew closer, I buried my annoyance under a mountain of preparation. If Richard wanted to show off his star colleagues, then fine. I'd host the best damn dinner they'd ever attended. I planned the menu meticulously, with dishes that balanced elegance and comfort. I even dusted off the fancy plates we only use for special occasions. But as I folded napkins and arranged flowers on the dining table, a nagging thought kept creeping in. Why did he seem so invested in this? Richard wasn't usually one for grand gestures, especially when it came to his work. When Saturday evening arrived, I was ready, or so I thought. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath before opening the door. Ethan stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, with a grin so disarming I almost forgot my frustration. He held out a bottle of wine that looked expensive enough to be a bribe. Good evening, Mrs. Sinclair, he said, his voice warm and confident. Richard's told us so much about you. He says you're the real boss of the house. I let out a surprised laugh, and before I could reply, Jake appeared behind him, holding up a box of pastries like he'd just won a prize. I brought dessert, he said, his voice a mix of pride and nerves. Richard told me you love sweets. I blinked at them, momentarily caught off guard by their charm. And then Clara emerged, the last piece of this odd trio. She was effortlessly chic, with the kind of poise that suggested she was just as comfortable leading a boardroom as she was walking a runway. Don't let these two fools fool you, she said, smirking. I'm here to make sure the evening runs smoothly. Her tone was teasing, but her words carried a confidence that left no room for doubt. As I stepped aside to let them in, my initial irritation began to fade, replaced by curiosity. These weren't just colleagues, they were a team. And from the way they carried themselves, it felt like they were here for more than just dinner. There was an energy to them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. They exchanged knowing glances and inside jokes, like they shared a secret too big for words. As we moved to the living room for pre-dinner drinks, I found myself wondering, what exactly had Richard told them about me? More importantly, why did it feel like they had a plan? Part 2. The setup. The evening started smoothly enough. After the initial introductions, we moved to the living room for drinks and small talk. Ethan, Jake, and Clara made themselves at home in a way that suggested they weren't strangers to these kinds of gatherings. They blended their charm and energy effortlessly, as if they were seasoned performers stepping onto a well-rehearsed stage. Richard was in his element, laughing at Ethan's jokes and clinking glasses with Jake, while Clara peppered me with compliments about the decor. This room is gorgeous, she said, running her fingers lightly over the edge of the mantel. Let me guess, your idea, not Richard's? I chuckled, appreciating the playful jab at my husband's utter lack of interior design skills. You guessed right. Left to him, We'd probably still have the futon from his bachelor pad. She laughed, the kind of laugh that made you feel like you were in on some private joke. I should have been charmed by her, but there was something about the way she studied me, her head tilted ever so slightly, that made me feel like I was under a microscope. Meanwhile, Ethan and Jake were talking with Richard, but I couldn't help noticing how their conversation felt a little too practiced. Jake asked questions about Richard's early career, and Ethan interjected with anecdotes that showcased my husband's achievements. It was flattering, sure, but it also felt staged, like they were deliberately building him up for my benefit. When I excused myself to check on the food, Clara immediately followed, offering to help. I hadn't expected that. Most guests would have stayed comfortably seated, but Clara walked into my kitchen like she'd been there 100 times before. "So," she said, grabbing a dish towel and leaning casually against the counter, "Richard told us you're the one who keeps him sane." I glanced at her, surprised by her sudden change in tone. She was no longer the bubbly charmer. Now she sounded sincere. Almost too sincere. "He said that?" I asked, trying not to let the warmth spread to my cheeks. "Constantly," Clara said with a nod. "He calls you his secret weapon. Says you're the reason he's been able to push himself so hard at work lately." I froze for a second, my hands hovering over the salad bowl. Richard wasn't exactly the sentimental type, and hearing this from Clara felt strange. Did he really say that? Or was this part of whatever game they were playing? "Well, he doesn't say that to me," I replied with a small laugh, trying to brush it off. Clara gave me a knowing look like she saw right through me. "Maybe he should," she said softly before grabbing a knife to start chopping vegetables. Her words lingered in the air, filling the room with an awkward tension I couldn't shake. As I watched her expertly handle the knife, I wondered why someone so polished, so poised, would care about impressing me. Back in the living room, things were getting stranger. Ethan had found his way to our bookshelf and was flipping through an old photo album. "You guys look so happy here," he said, holding up a picture of Richard and me from our first anniversary trip. Jake leaned over to take a look, his face lighting up. "Wow, Richard, you used to have hair," he teased, earning a round of laughter from everyone, including my husband. I joined them, but the warmth of the moment didn't last long. Ethan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Richard really looks up to you," he said, his voice almost too earnest. "He talks about you at work all the time. Says you're his rock." "Does he?" I asked, my voice more guarded than I intended. "Oh yeah," Ethan said, nodding vigorously. "He says you're the smartest person he knows. That you're the one who keeps him grounded." Before I could respond, Richard cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed. "All right, enough about me," he said with a laugh. "Let's not make this the Richard appreciation dinner." But the damage was done. Their words had already sunk in, leaving me with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. As dinner approached, the atmosphere shifted again. The three of them began moving with a strange synchronization, almost as if they'd rehearsed this entire evening. Clara helped me plate the food while Ethan set the table with military precision. Jake brought out the wine, pouring it with the flair of a professional sommelier. It felt surreal, watching them transform my home into a fine dining experience. They weren't just guests. They were participants in some elaborate plan, and I was starting to feel like the only one who hadn't been let in on the secret. As we sat down to eat, Richard raised his glass, his smile warm but slightly nervous. "Before we dig in," he said, "I just want to say how grateful I am to have all of you here tonight. And especially you," he added, turning to me. "Thank you for always being my partner, even when I get caught up in everything else." I smiled, but his words only deepened the mystery. Why did this dinner feel like more than just a dinner? And why did it seem like everyone here knew the answer but me? Part 3: The Reveal. Dinner was exquisite, but it was the conversation that stole the show, or rather, the way it seemed so intricately curated. The three of them worked like a well-rehearsed orchestra, taking turns leading discussions, subtly steering topics to focus on Richard and occasionally on me. Clara had a knack for drawing out personal stories. "So, how did you two meet?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with genuine curiosity. Or was it calculated charm? Richard and I exchanged a glance, a brief flicker of shared memory passing between us. "At a bookshop," I said with a smile. He bumped into me and knocked over an entire display of travel guides. Ethan leaned in, grinning. "Let me guess, he tried to play it off cool?" "Oh no," I laughed, shaking my head. "He was a complete mess. Apologized at least 10 times and then offered to buy me coffee to make up for it." "Classic Richard," Jake chimed in, raising his glass. Always trying to fix things, even when they're not his fault. Richard chuckled, but there was a slight edge to his smile, as if he were bracing for something. I noticed the way his hand gripped his wine glass just a little too tightly. As the conversation flowed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the three of them were deliberately pulling strings, weaving a narrative around us that felt both flattering and unsettling. They weren't just getting to know me, they were building a case piece by piece for something I couldn't quite grasp. Then, as the plates were being cleared and dessert was about to be served, Richard stood up. He clinked his glass lightly, drawing everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," he began, his voice steady but tinged with nervous energy. "First, thank you all for coming tonight. It means a lot to me. And second," he paused, his eyes meeting mine, "I want to thank you, honey, for everything." I felt the room tilt slightly, my stomach flipping as I nodded, unsure of where this was going. "Work has been intense," he continued, running a hand through his hair. "And I know I haven't been the best husband lately. I've been distant, preoccupied. But I want you to know that none of it changes how much I appreciate you, how much I love you." The air grew thick with emotion. I blinked, caught off guard by his sincerity. "And that's why I asked Ethan, Jake, and Clara to join us tonight," he said, his words suddenly picking up speed. "Because they're here to replace me. Temporarily." The silence that followed was deafening. "Replace you?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, looking both sheepish and resolute. "Yes. Replace me. In all the ways I've been falling short." I glanced around the table hoping for some clue, some sign that this was all a joke. But the trio looked at me with calm, encouraging expressions, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "What does that even mean?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "Replace you how?" Clara leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Richard told us how much you've been carrying on your own, managing the house, handling the little things he's been too busy to notice. He wanted us to step in and make things easier for you." Jake chimed in next, his voice full of enthusiasm. "We've each taken on specific roles to help out. Ethan's got the outdoor stuff covered, gardening, maintenance, that sort of thing. I'm handling cooking and errands. And Clara's your go-to for anything organizational or tech-related." It was like they'd rehearsed this, their words flowing seamlessly from one to the next. "Think of us as your personal team," Ethan added, flashing a disarming grin. "We're here to take the load off and give you a break." I stared at Richard, my heart pounding. "You planned this?" He nodded, looking at me earnestly. "I know it's unconventional, but I wanted to show you how much I value you, how much I see what you do for us." For a moment I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or throw my wine glass across the room. This wasn't just a dinner, it was an intervention. A bizarre, deeply thoughtful, and slightly insane intervention. "And how long is this supposed to last?" I asked, my voice tinged with both disbelief and curiosity. "As long as you need," Clara said simply, her eyes meeting mine with a sincerity that made me feel oddly safe. The room fell silent again, everyone waiting for my reaction. I looked at the three of them, then at Richard. His expression was a mix of hope and vulnerability, and for the first time in a long while I felt the weight of his love, not in words but in action. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's see what you've got." And just like that, the dinner took on a new meaning. It wasn't about introductions or small talk anymore. It was the beginning of something I couldn't quite define but already knew would change everything. What would you do if your partner surprised you with a plan as elaborate as Richard's? Would you find it endearing or overwhelming? Write your answer in comments. Part 4. The surprises begin. The next morning, I woke up still unsure whether the previous night had been some elaborate prank or a bizarrely thoughtful gesture. As the sunlight streamed through the curtains, I half expected Richard to roll over and laugh, admitting he'd cooked up the whole scheme for laughs. But instead I found the other half of the bed empty. Before I could wonder where he was, a loud noise startled me. Something metallic clanging in the backyard. Curious and slightly annoyed, I threw on a robe and peeked out the window. There, in the middle of my neglected garden, was Ethan. He was shirtless, of course he was, swinging a massive pair of hedge clippers with an energy that felt more at home in a gym than a suburban backyard. The overgrown bushes, which had been mocking me for months, were already neatly trimmed, and he was now tackling the mess of weeds around the flower beds. "Good morning," he called cheerfully when he spotted me. "Don't worry about breakfast. Jake's got it covered. I thought I'd get a head start out here." Thanks." I replied, still too groggy to process the surreal sight of a literal Greek god landscaping my yard at 7 a.m. As I shuffled toward the kitchen in search of coffee, the aroma of sizzling bacon hit me like a warm hug. Jake was at the stove, whistling as he expertly flipped pancakes. A pot of fresh coffee sat on the counter, steam curling invitingly from the spout. "Morning," Jake said, beaming at me like we were old friends. "How do you like your eggs?" I blinked at him, still processing the scene. Scrambled. Coming right up. Before I could even sit down, Clara walked in with my laptop tucked under one arm and a clipboard in the other. "Good, you're up," she said briskly, sliding into the seat across from me. "I've already started organizing your files. Your desktop was chaos, by the way. Also, I took the liberty of researching some solutions for that squeaky dishwasher you mentioned last night." I stared at her, utterly speechless. "You were listening to me?" "Of course," she said with a smile that managed to be both warm and intimidating. "Richard made it clear that we're here to help, so I'm diving in headfirst." I didn't know whether to feel grateful or overwhelmed. "This is a lot," I admitted, sipping the coffee Jake had just placed in front of me. "That's the point," Clara said, leaning forward. "You've been doing so much for so long, and we're here to make sure you finally get the break you deserve. Just let us handle things for a while." Despite my initial skepticism, their enthusiasm was disarming. Jake's breakfast was the best meal I'd had in weeks. Fluffy pancakes, perfectly crispy bacon, and eggs cooked just the way I liked them. Ethan, meanwhile, had transformed the backyard into something out of a home and garden magazine. He even found time to fix the broken latch on the gate. Clara was the biggest surprise of all. She wasn't just organizing my files, she was optimizing my entire life. By lunchtime, she'd set up an online calendar to streamline my appointments, ordered replacement parts for the dishwasher, and emailed a landscaper about installing raised flower beds. As the day went on, I found myself succumbing to their charm. They weren't just competent, they were genuinely kind. Ethan cracked jokes as he hauled bags of mulch to the backyard. Jake hummed cheerful tunes while folding laundry I hadn't even realized was piling up. Clara offered insightful suggestions for a work project I'd been struggling with, her tone supportive but firm. By the time Richard got home, I was feeling something I hadn't experienced in ages: relief. For once, the weight of the world wasn't entirely on my shoulders. "What do you think?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of discontent. I hesitated, still unsure how to put my feelings into words. "They're amazing," I admitted. "But I still don't understand why you're doing this." Richard took my hand, his expression earnest. "Because I've been watching you hold everything together for too long," he said softly. "You've been my rock, and I've let that go unacknowledged. I wanted to show you how much I see you, how much I appreciate you, and I knew I couldn't do it alone." His words hit me harder than I expected. For years I'd felt invisible in the daily grind of life, managing our home, supporting his career, and quietly pushing my own dreams to the back burner. Hearing him acknowledge that was like a balm for my soul. "I don't know what to say," I murmured, blinking back tears. "Just say you'll let us do this for you," he said with a small smile. "At least for a little while." Looking around at the transformed backyard, the spotless kitchen, and the beautifully folded laundry, I realized something surprising. I didn't want to say no. "All right," I said finally, my voice tinged with both gratitude and disbelief. "Let's see where this goes." Little did I know, this was only the beginning of what would turn out to be a week full of surprises, challenges, and revelations that would change everything I thought I knew about love, teamwork, and the true meaning of partnership. Part 5. The Emotional Turn. By the third day, I had officially stopped questioning whether this surreal arrangement was real. It was as real as the perfectly organized pantry Clara had tackled this morning, as real as Ethan's freshly mulched flower beds, and as real as Jake's herb-crusted salmon that could have been served at a Michelin-starred restaurant. But what surprised me most wasn't their efficiency or the sheer amount of work they accomplished. It was how they seemed to genuinely care. Each of them brought something different to the table, not just in their tasks but in the way they connected with me. Ethan was the heart of the group. He worked hard, laughed easily, and had a knack for making me feel like I was the most important person in the room. One afternoon, while pruning a stubborn rosebush, he looked up and said, "You know, Richard always talks about how much he admires you. He says you've got this inner strength that keeps him grounded." I blinked, caught off guard. "He says that?" "Yeah," Ethan said with a grin. "I mean, he doesn't say it like that at the office. He's not exactly Mr. Sentimental. But you can tell. It's in the way he talks about you. the way his face lights up when someone mentions your name. I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Jake, meanwhile, was the soul of the operation. He was a nurturer, always looking for ways to make me feel cared for. "Do you trust me with dinner tonight?" he asked that same evening, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Do I even have a choice?" I teased. "Nope," he said with a laugh. The meal he prepared was stunning. Not just in taste but in thoughtfulness. He remembered that I loved cilantro and added just the right amount to the salsa. He remembered I preferred sparkling water over wine, and had a chilled bottle waiting at the table. He even remembered my offhand comment about how desserts were my weakness and surprised me with a molten chocolate lava cake. Clara, though, was the one who truly got under my skin, not in a bad way, but in a way that forced me to confront things I hadn't been ready to face. One afternoon she found me sitting at my desk, staring blankly at an email I'd been meaning to reply to for weeks. "Writer's block?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. "Something like that," I muttered. She didn't push but quietly walked over and placed a cup of tea on the desk. "You're allowed to ask for help, you know," she said softly. "It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what it was about her. Maybe the calm authority in her voice or the way she always seemed to see right through me, but I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't expected. "It's just hard sometimes," I admitted. "Balancing everything, trying to be everything to everyone. Sometimes it feels like if I stop moving, even for a second, the whole world will collapse." Clara nodded, her expression understanding. "I get that," she said. "But here's the thing, you're not alone. You've got people who want to help you if you let them." Her words stayed with me long after she left the room. That evening, as we all sat down to dinner, I found myself overwhelmed, not by the tasks they'd completed, but by the emotions they'd stirred in me. For so long, I'd carried the weight of responsibility on my own, convincing myself that asking for help was a sign of failure. But these three had shown me something I hadn't realized I needed: permission to let go. As the meal wound down, I finally found the courage to speak up. "I don't know how to thank you all," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "You've done so much for me, for this house, and for Richard. More than I ever could have expected." Ethan grinned. "Hey, it's all part of the plan." Jake nodded. "You've spent so much time taking care of everyone else. It's about time someone took care of you." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "You deserve it," she said simply. For the first time in years, I felt the tears spill over. Not out of sadness or frustration, but out of sheer gratitude. These weren't just Richard's colleagues anymore. They were my team, my allies, my unexpected champions. As I wiped my tears away, Richard stood up, raising his glass. "To my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For being the strongest, smartest, most incredible person I know. And for putting up with this crazy plan of mine." Everyone laughed, clinking their glasses together. But as I looked around the table at their smiling faces, I realized this wasn't just about a crazy plan. It was about love, messy, imperfect, beautifully unconditional love. Do you think Richard's approach to showing appreciation was effective? Or would you have preferred a more direct gesture? Part 6. The grand finale. The week flew by in a blur of unexpected kindness, heartfelt moments, and a level of care I hadn't known I needed. By the time Friday rolled around, the house sparkled. The garden looked like it belonged in a lifestyle magazine, and I felt like I'd been wrapped in a cocoon of love and appreciation. But it wasn't just about the tasks they completed. What Ethan, Jake, and Clara brought into my life went deeper. They made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I felt like the weight of the world wasn't entirely on my shoulders. That evening, Richard came home earlier than usual. He walked in carrying a bouquet of my favorite flowers, sunflowers bright and cheerful, and a sheepish smile. "Dinner's on me tonight," he announced, setting the flowers on the counter. Jake, who had been sautéing something mouth-watering in the kitchen, raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you're kicking me out of my domain." Richard grinned. "You've earned the night off. Besides, I think it's time I remind my wife I'm still capable of cooking, even if it's just takeout." Everyone laughed, but I could sense something more behind Richard's words. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet determination that made my heart squeeze. After dinner, takeout sushi, which Richard had artfully arranged on plates to make it look homemade. We gathered in the living room. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, the kind of comfortable camaraderie that only comes after a shared experience. Ethan poured drinks, Jake passed around dessert, mini cheesecakes he'd whipped up earlier, And Clara sat beside me, her clipboard finally nowhere in sight. Richard stood, clearing his throat. Before we wrap up this crazy week, I just want to say something. All eyes turned to him, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. This week wasn't just about making my wife's life easier, he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. It was about showing her how much she means to me, how much I see everything she does, not just for me but for everyone around her. She's been my rock, my partner, my everything. And somewhere along the way, I stopped showing her that. I felt my throat tighten, my eyes already welling up with tears. So when I realized I couldn't do it alone, I called in reinforcements, Richard continued, gesturing to Ethan, Jake, and Clara. Because I wanted her to feel the love and appreciation she deserves, even if it took a village to make it happen. There was a brief pause before Ethan raised his glass. To teamwork, he said with a grin, breaking the tension with his easy charm. To love, Jake added, smiling warmly. To never underestimating a woman's worth, Clara finished, her eyes twinkling. We all clinked glasses, laughter and warmth filling the room. But Richard wasn't done yet. Actually, he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small envelope. There's one more thing. He handed it to me, and I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a brochure for a weekend getaway at a charming lakeside cabin. I booked us a trip, Richard said softly. Just the two of us. No work, no responsibilities. Just us. I stared at the brochure, my heart swelling with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Richard, I know it's not enough to make up for everything, he said, cutting me off before I could protest. But I want us to start fresh. To reconnect. And to remind you that you're the most important person in my life. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I threw my arms around him. You're impossible, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. But I love you. The room erupted in cheers and applause, Ethan hollering like he was at a football game while Jake and Clara exchanged knowing smiles. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, stories and heartfelt goodbyes as Ethan, Jake and Clara prepared to leave. When the door finally closed behind them, the house felt quieter, but not empty. Richard and I sat together on the couch, his arm around my shoulders and my head resting against his chest. Did I surprise you? He asked, his voice teasing but hopeful. You did, I admitted, smiling up at him. And you reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place. He kissed my forehead, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like everything was exactly where it should be. That week hadn't just changed my perspective on love and partnership. It had brought us back to each other in a way I hadn't even realized we needed. And as we sat there watching the flicker of the fireplace, I couldn't help but think that sometimes, the most surprising gestures come from the people you already know best. What moment in the story resonated with you the most and why?